You're watching the Isaiah Factor Uncensored.
And welcome back to The Factor Uncensored, the second half hour. The number of young people across this country dying from drug overdoses is alarming. It has doubled recently. And as I find out, the pandemic has a lot to do with it.
Isaiah, folks have been locked up in homes. These kids, these adolescents, 14 to 18-year-olds in particular, have not had access to their social life, to their schools, and et cetera. And because of that, what we've seen is an increase in overdose deaths. From the recent years, we've seen doubling amounts over the past, from 2015 to 2020. The number of overdose deaths have doubled, and because of that, especially in that age population, it's a very big problem, Isaiah.
Now, when we talk about the pandemic and being locked up and at home and away from your social network, your friends, I think that would include a drug dealer. So where would these kids be getting these drugs if they weren't around their friends, their social circles, or their drug dealer?
Yeah, Isaiah. Well, it's surprisingly, they still have access, whether it be through sneaking it in through friends, through other means. But what we saw interesting, Isaiah, is that people, especially in these adolescents, were not dying from your, overdoses that we've been seeing in the years. They were dying from fentanyl. 77% of these overdose deaths were related to fentanyl. That is a synthetic opioid that is made in homes and labs and dispersed into marijuana, dispersed into other drugs to give them a high. What we were seeing is folks weren't just using regular weed. They weren't just using cocaine. They were mixing it with the fentanyl, which then that gives you a much, much, much higher risk to develop cardiac and respiratory problems and also die.
That's the danger of just wanting more and more without, in some instances, people, it's my understanding, don't know it's in their drugs, right?
That's correct, Isaiah. A lot of the times that these kids would go to the dealers, to their friends, and say, hey, listen, I need something extra. I need that little bit more of a high. I've been using marijuana. I've been using all these things in the past year, and I want something different. I want something stronger. That stronger, even a little bit of it laced with fentanyl, can result in respiratory complications and death.
Do we know if any of these deaths can be attributed to ISO? You and I talked about that a while back. For the viewer out there who don't know what ISO is, tell us a little bit about that and just how much more deadlier it is and stronger than fentanyl.
That is correct, Isaiah. This is also a synthetic form of a opioid that is made in the labs, in the homes. And what we've seen is this is almost 20 times more potent than fentanyl itself. And we already know that fentanyl is 200 times more potent than morphine. So if you can imagine the spectrum of how intense this drug is, in just a little hint of it, just a little hint somewhere in that drug can cause these deaths. And we even saw some instances where it somehow got rubbed on the skin, it absorbed through the skin and caused folks to have respiratory complications and end up in the emergency rooms and hospitalizations.
Now, there is a drug that many emergency responders have on them to counteract fentanyl. I can't recall the name, and I'm sure you know, but that drug doesn't work on ISO, though, right?
That's correct, Isaiah. It's called Narcan. It's the generic form is naloxone. Now multiple different formularies of it exist. However, you're right in the sense that it is so potent, this ISO drug is so potent, Isaiah, that even Narcan does not have its effect. And so that's why it's very important to get immediate medical attention ASAP. If you have done any sort of these sorts of drugs, perhaps, and you're having any respiratory issues, or you find somebody on the ground, call the ambulance, call 911 immediately.
Now, for parents out there, what would be your best piece of advice if we have this surge in young people dying from drug overdoses? What would you tell parents out there?
Have an open communication, Isaiah. That is the very most important thing. Talk to your kids about it. You know, just like we would have to talk about sex and education from that standpoint as kids are growing up, we need to have that talk with these kids about these drugs, these overdoses, these illicit substances. It's very important that we have that open line of communication and discussion with our kids about this, Isaiah.